Good evening, everybody, to our One World presentation. Some watched it now, the film Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook. Others who didn't saw it should watch it later, because it's a very, very good film about voter suppression and what in the United States goes wrong in this kind of policy, I would say. And now we would like to talk about the film and what we can do about it. We means mostly the Americans do about it, because I'm German, and so I think I can't do very much against it. I got here, okay, my name is Axel Bussmer from the Humanistische Union. It's a civil rights organization. It's like the German pardon to the ACLU, which is in American famous. And I'm the host for the evening with One World, Lichtblick Cinema, and other American Voices Abroad, who are staying here in Berlin and who are also participating, some in the venue here and some online. And on the panel, I got Mark Heller. He is one of the producers from the film. He is graduated of Harvard and Harvard Law School. He worked at Goldman & Sachs and Co. Later, he had an electric car company in California and is now doing this project. We got Doug Hillmer. He worked for the Census Bureau for many years, especially on the American Community Service, which helps locate officials, community leaders, and business understand the changes taking place in the community. So, yeah, maybe I can say you have to understand who can vote and which are the voters. And if that's wrong, you must correct me later. And we got John Oberg. He worked for the US Senate and the US Department of Education for 16 years. He's now retired, and he blew the whistle on false claims of student loan lenders, which he now achieved settlements in 7 of 9 cases against them. So I'm happy that they're here. I'm happy that they got more knowledge about these issues than I got, and so I got a lot of questions to you three. And we said that we make the discussion first mainly about the film, the problems which were addressed in the film, and later what the Americans can do against this voter suppression playbook. And you from the public can also ask questions. Mainly, the easiest way is over the chat and not via webcam, because we like to record this panel and put it online, and I don't know if everybody is okay with his face on the web, which we are here in the panel. And my first question goes to Mac. What was for you the reason or the motivation to make this film?
Thank you, Axel. And thank you, everybody, for assembling. I like Lichtblick because we should shine a bright light on this. And I especially appreciate your speaking English because I would be sitting here with a puzzled look on my face if you were speaking German. We made this film
Maybe
because
Google Translator helps.
We made this film because we saw behavior that we thought was wrong. And I, for my life, have woken up every morning proud of our democracy in the United States, and proud especially of Election Day, where everybody has a voice and all of those voices are equal. And I am shocked and disappointed at the idea that some Americans would be trying to prevent other Americans from voting. And so I wanted to learn more, and we assembled a team and we studied the issue and discovered that there was really quite a lot of voter suppression going on. By the way, we also wanted to study the other side of the debate and listen to it. As you see, we did in the film. Is there fraud? I hate fraud. Everybody, you hate fraud. Everybody hates fraud. And so we wanted to find out whether that was really going on. Were people really voting improperly? And the answer, as you saw in the film, is no. So we wanted to, there's a lot of good academic literature and legal writing about voter suppression in the United States, but we wanted to tell the human stories and make sure that people understood this as a series of human stories of exclusion from our democracy. And so we did. We feel strongly that our voters should choose our politicians. Our politicians should not have the opportunity to choose their voters. We feel strongly that this is not a historic, not a partisan matter, but rather a matter of fairness and morality. And we feel strongly that the historical associations of vote suppression must be discussed. That's why we made the film.
Mm. And when you make the filming, what did you learn? And what was the most things where you said, "Oh, I didn't expect that."
I did not expect to, I'll say it this way. The laws that have the effect of suppressing votes are presented as benign, with no evil intent, and merely administrative. They are only bureaucracy. They are not an intent, or so it is said, to exclude voters. But when you line them all up, as we do in the film, you recognize a pattern. And in the course of making the film and beginning to see this pattern emerge, we began to keep a list of the voter suppression techniques that we saw. And we cover only 9 of them in the film. But in fact, we have found about 50. And when you read, and we put them all into a document entitled How to Suppress the Vote. And it's a shocking document because when you read these things, you say to yourself, this did not happen by accident. So that was surprise number 1. Surprise number 2, I think, is a very important surprise, which is the guys from the North Carolina Voter Integrity Project. I may think that what they're doing is shameful, and that if there were a camera in the room, they would run out the door. But no, they are very proud of what they're doing. They believe that what they're doing is patriotic. And so a really important lesson from this film is that different people in the United States are dealing with very different facts. Mike and Jay in the film are sure that our elections are full of voter fraud. And so when we approached them about, could we film you, half expecting them to say, no, get out of here, they said, yes, please. And as we drive around in the months before the election and find fraudulent voters, you'll be in the back seat with the camera running. This will be great. And of course, Axel, we waste, I don't know how many days and weeks sitting with these guys trying to find fraud. And when they don't find any after, with us, weeks of looking, in their case, years of looking, a evidence-based person would say, well, we at least need to consider the possibility that there is no such fraud. But that is not what they say. You've seen in the film what they say is, well, the fact that we didn't find any proves only that it's even bigger than we thought. And the perpetrators of this fraud are even smarter, even more devious than we had imagined. This is a national conspiracy. And that point of view, which I may regard as wrong, factually wrong, that point of view is a very important point of view for us all to recognize and understand. Those were the surprises.
And before John and Duke joined in discussion, one more question, the structure from the film. I mentioned it here in the cinema. I thought was very clear, and even if you don't know the American voting laws as a German, you watch it and you say in the end, yes, I understand it. I understand where are the problems. So how do you come to this structure who is very clear?
Well, history is not clear as it unfolds, but sometimes when you look back, it becomes clearer. And this whole voter suppression thing used to be primarily in the American South. And the really scary thing about the pattern now is that it's not just in the American South. It's in Wisconsin, it's in Ohio. Gerrymandering is a big thing in Pennsylvania. And so these laws, these ways of excluding 1% here, 2% there, are now national. They are, the way voting works in our country, as you saw from the film, is each state has the power to control its own voting. And so what was once something concentrated in the states of the former Confederate South is now a national trend.
That's one point here in Germany. It's one state, one voting law, and that's it. And if you're 18, you got permission to vote, and you can vote wherever you are in Germany. And that's no big deal. Also, if you want to vote per mail, that's also no big deal. They said, I like to vote per mail. They said, it's okay. You do it, and that's it. So all these things the Americans do now to get Americans not to vote are, for us really, I would say, scary. It's more like you watch a third world country who is a dictator who is doing some things which aren't right and which are very big steps away from this old principles, the American principle, one man, one vote. And so I think we can, I would be happy if John and Duke join us now to discuss these various problems or these points where the Americans now get voter suppression things, like it was in the end of the film, these voting laws with a driver license and the IDs. So I mean, it's also for me a question, why that? Why not something other, or why not somebody who pays his taxes can vote because he pays taxes? But I think the first would be good if Doc answers about how is you who is eligible to vote in a county from your work in the Census Bureau.
Let me just back up a little bit.
Yeah.
First of all, I was thinking of, when listening to Mac discuss the patriotic feeling these fraud hunters had, I was thinking of the poem by T.S. Eliot, McCavity, the Mystery Cat, because McCavity is never there when wrongdoing is done, but that just makes their suspicion that McCavity is responsible even greater. So I was just thinking of that. the Constitution delegates the administration of elections to states there's some role for Congress reserved there, and John can speak much better on this than I can. But for all practical purposes, unlike Germany, in the United States, we have 50 separate election administration systems. There's your first vulnerability. There's the first way that people with nefarious ideas can jump in, and I'm going to deal, if we have time, I will go into one of these groups later. The census, and right now it's of course incredibly timely because of what's going on with the 2020 census. The census is obligated to provide, for starters, 50 numbers, one per state. And that says, here's your population based on the census. In addition, of course, there's another column that says, and here's the number of seats you get now, each state in the House of Representatives based on that number. And based on the fact that we have 435 representatives. And for people from Germany, unlike Germany, our number is fixed. That 435 is not a malleable number. It cannot be changed. It can only be changed by an act of Congress, and it has not been changed in over 100 years. So that's what the census does. And then the census provides a huge data file to the states, which the states can use to then determine the geographic boundaries for each of those districts that they've been allotted by the census. It's called the public law file. And that they can, of course, we saw in the film how they can use that information, and a lot of these people are using mapping software, and they can then say, oh yeah, I want to isolate this group or that group. So the census role basically stops with delivering that information to the states. Then the states take over, and the states actually delegate even further down. Many activities are delegated down to county and local jurisdictions without much review at all by the states. So what we have is a very, very complex voting system. And if you look back over a couple hundred years, there have been instances of all kinds of nefarious things done, many of them not detected. Let me just say one thing about voter fraud. In-person voter fraud, people have shown over and over, is virtually non-existent. But what does exist is large-scale fraud, or the possibility of large-scale fraud. This came up when electronic voting was introduced. Because there, basically, when we were introducing electronic voting machines, the companies that were building these machines and pushing them out there were basically unregulated, and the software used for those machines was not available for public scrutiny, public review. Now, there are not too many cases of fraud that were found, but the possibility of large-scale fraud existed there. And one other thing I'd want to mention as an example, and I'll be as brief as I can. North Carolina District 9 in the 2018 election actually elected somebody by fraud, but it was not the kind of fraud that's discussed in the film. It wasn't in-person fraud. It was a person who went around to people in one county, took their absentee ballots, assuring them that he actually was going to act in their interest, and went and filled them out for them. A lot of these people have very little education. And of course, he fraudulently filled out all those absentee ballots for the Republican. So it's kind of ironic that, you know, people like Chris Kobach and all these other people who are shouting fraud don't seem to ever remember that case. That's the one major case of fraud in recent history. That wasn't in-person fraud, it was a person deceiving voters. So that's what I would say right now. And I'm not sure if I've answered the question, Axel, but election administration is done at a very local level in the United States. For instance, even qualifying to become an election worker can be politicized. I read a case of a person in Denton County, Texas, who was not accepted because that person's a Democrat. Now, that's not, we're talking about just being there working in the election at the polling site. So these things are, we have a tremendous number of problems that contribute to voter suppression. And a lot of it is because we have an extremely vulnerable system here. So I'll just stop with that.
Okay, before I go to John, I think a follow-up question to you. When you say the system is very vulnerable, were there attempts to make it less vulnerable or more stable? And because you can do it, I mean, we here in Germany have it, and it's, yeah, I say it's an easy system. In other European countries, it's also a very easy system. Why didn't Americans update their system? I mean, it's a system from the beginning, as far as I understand it.
John, why don't you take that?
Yes, Alex.
Are you?
Thank you. First of all, hello to Berlin. Hi, Berlin.
Hi, John.
Es freut mich, mit euch allen betreffen, zu zoomen hier.
Please allow cheering now.
First of all, to Mac, this is just a remarkable film. Thank you. It is so impressive. If I were still back teaching, I would be using this in my classroom at any level, undergraduate or graduate. I would be asking my students, because there is so much in this film, not to wring their hands and say, oh, this is so terrible, which it is, of course, but I would be asking them to take the different parts of the playbook, the 9 different ones, and I'm shocked to know there's 50. So I would have to have a pretty big class, I guess, to assign everybody a part and say, what are the remedies here? We can see what's happening. How are we going to fix this? Alex, to your question directly, in the United States, we had, despite its decentralization, for decades, a functioning election system. It was built simply on integrity and the rule of law. Fraud was not a problem. Another thing about Mac's film, I think, is also his comment here that, yes, I would expect the other side, so to speak, not to want to appear on film for fear of being indicted. And that might be one of the remedies, is to indict some of the people for their actions. But that they actually willingly went on camera, and you edited it very well to show, in certain instances, no, they hadn't found any fraud. They hadn't found fraud when they looked for license plates of people driving around to different polling places. They didn't find other kinds of fraud, but this did not convince them at all. And this is very discouraging. And so maybe when we talk about remedies to these specific techniques, we also need to think about remedies to this kind of thinking. Now, I am encouraged, as we all have been, by the fact that Chris Kobach has been turned out of office by the good people of Kansas twice. He ran for governor, he was defeated. He ran for senator and he was defeated in the primary. So it is not as though they can take this, and I don't think for a second the Chris Kobachs of the world are sincere. I think you found a couple of people in the Voter Integrity Project by the name of Mike and Jay, I'm very surprised at Jay. Mike, I kind of understand. Jay is a mystery to me that he's a retired lieutenant colonel and believes this nonsense. But anyway, that's, I just want to say, what a great film. Thank you very much, Berlin, for showing it. And that's what I would be doing with it. And I hope it gets wide usage now so that we look not just in the long term, but also in the short term, both as to what remedies are available. I have been out there on my blog and in other forums and so on saying we had better be ready to deal with the consequences of voter suppression. In the Electoral College, the governors need to be ready to know what is going on, and maybe even in the House of Representatives, where there are remedies to correct gerrymandering by not seating gerrymandered delegations, which is the prerogative of the House. The Supreme Court doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. Anyway, that's my contribution. Thanks a lot for having me on.
No problem.
Axel, may I comment, please?
Yeah, sure, please.
Because I don't know that any of the three of us have a answer to your central question, which is to a German, to a Canadian, this whole topic is a mystery. And you're saying, why is this not a simple problem of administration? Why is this not a management issue? Why is this a political issue? Why can't information technology solve between 90 and 100% of this? We solve this in every other area of modern life, from credit card billing to telephone calls. These are not difficult questions. I've had this discussion with other Germans, with the head of election administration in Canada commented to me that it seemed irrational to him to have 50 different systems and to have the system in each of those 50 states administered by a partisan person rather than by a nonpartisan citizen commission. And of course, all of that's correct. But the essence of this problem in the United States is that incumbents who have gained their power through the existing system will only rarely want to change the existing system. And we used to have traditions in our country about, as John was saying, about fairness and integrity in all elements of government, starting first with our election systems. But those have been lost over the last few years, certainly damaged, I hope not lost entirely. But depending on the outcome of this coming election, either there will or will not be a large revolution in US law, as we saw in 1974 after Nixon and Watergate, where there was a whole set of what we now call post-Watergate laws that regulated the power of politicians and put checks and balances into many elements of our system. In the last 2 years in our country, we have seen little parts of this. So Michigan was a very gerrymandered state, and the state legislature of Michigan, which was itself gerrymandered, showed no interest in changing that, but a citizen initiative put on the ballot a law to take gerrymandering out of the hands of the legislature and put it in a citizen commission. That passed. Same thing in Colorado, Utah, Missouri. There are a number of citizen-led initiatives that have expressed frustration with the legislature and taken a part of the democracy back from the incumbent politicians. We'll see how broad that movement is about 4 weeks from now, and then in the months following.
I saw one question here, but before you can ask him, I got one I mean, last question for this round. In the film, we saw just Republicans who do this voter suppression playbook and who benefit from it in a large scale. But my question was, does Democrats do it also, or is it just Republican only?
No, it's not Republican only. I live in a state, and John part-time there too, Maryland, which is a gerrymandered state. Right now, Virginia, across the river from us, is considering moving to a bipartisan commission to doing to drawing the boundaries of the congressional district. The Democrats pushed very hard for that while they were in the minority. Now the Virginia Democrats are kind of arguing against it. So the problem is that, and I think Max said this, people like, they like the status quo. Generally, they like, I'm in this position, I'm familiar with this. In fact, if you look at the, from the film, when the man was showing the map in Texas, well, especially the packing, the way the gerrymandering technique they use is packing. In many cases, the person who had been elected there finds out, well, I've got a safe district. That person will go along with that gerrymandering, even though overall for the state it's unhealthy, it's not good, it doesn't actually help the group this person is trying to represent for the entire state. But for that district, he now has a safe seat. So I think that, and I think that I would only qualify one thing that John said about the whole history of this, and that is that, and it's clear, Reverend Barber says this too, it wasn't until, certain things changed, and all of a sudden, we need, there's voter fraud, we need photo IDs, all these things came back. But to African Americans, this is basically, as many of them say in the film, this is basically, we're returning to a period when there was tremendous voter suppression of African Americans. I mean, so we have to remember that until mid 60s, there were horrible things in place to, poll taxes and other things to really prevent African Americans from voting in large numbers. But I would just like to mention one group that isn't mentioned in the film. And by the way, I want to do a shout out for the website from the film. It's a great website, Mac. And not only do I agree with John on the film itself, but the website, riggedthefilm.com, right? I think I said it right. The website is worth going to. There's a lot more information there, links to other great sites. But I want to mention one group that isn't mentioned in the film, but it's very closely connected to the Koch brothers. And it gives us an example of how a system that is somewhat vulnerable can be taken over. So in 1973, an organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, was formed. ALEC it was an ultra-conservative, pro-business, anti-government group, and they're a membership organization. They became increasingly important, especially in rural states. And they discovered that these state legislators often are part-time people. They don't have any budget for staffs. And so they were actually writing bills and handing them to them. In fact, there are cases where the language in a certain law is identical to the language in the ALEC proposal. It's unchanged. So this has been happening for a long time. And the reason I mention this is because the very first voter suppression technique in the playbook is Project Red Map. ALEC was instrumental in Project Red Map. ALEC was already in place. ALEC was in place for 30, 40 years when they moved to do that. So what that says to me is that there were vulnerabilities there. The right-wing groups seized on that. And to a large extent, because the Democrats weren't paying attention to state and local politics. And so ALEC really got its clutches in there. To this day, they've been through ups and downs. Last year, ALEC held a conference, and the topic was how to gerrymander. And they had technical people there. So ALEC is a very, very, an interesting example, I think, of how, if you aren't aware and aren't constantly fighting for it, how one group can come along and kind of take over a situation. And I think that's mentioned by one of the women in the film. And you can't take it we have to fight for it every day. Well, that's true. And ALEC is an example when we kind of were asleep at the wheel, and they took over. So it's just an interesting, I think, example of how sometimes we're vulnerable when we're not paying attention.
Okay. Yes, John?
If I could, yes, amend my statement just a little bit. Of course, we did have voter suppression, and of course, we did have to have the Voter Rights Act. And then we lost, 15 states were required, and I think the film made that point very clearly, to have pre-clearance by the Justice Department for their voter laws. And in the case of Shelby County versus Holder, we lost that 2013. Yes, I would also say, to Doug's point, yes, we do have democratic gerrymandering. My count is that we have approximately 10 states that are very badly gerrymandered. Democrats are only 2 or 3 of those. So if there were ever, if it ever came up in the House as to whether or not to seat delegations, state delegations that are gerrymandered or not, you'd have to have some sort of criteria to do that. That has been a suggestion. I don't take credit for it, but the suggestion for the House not to seat gerrymandered delegations comes from Lee Hamilton, a retired former congressman from Indiana, a Democrat, and the Republican William Cohen, who was a senator, a Republican senator from Maine for many years. Thank you.
Okay, before we come to the question from the chat, there would be your question. Will you come to me, or will you? You can ask the question and I repeat it.
Okay. So,
or you can speak very loud.
As far as we understood now, is that the system is really, really complex.
You need a microphone.
We have the electors, or the presidential electors who elect the president.
Electoral college.
And it's never the vote that counts directly. So the election in 2016 was not the only election where the presidential electors made a difference to the majority. I think before there were already 3 votes. So you said before the system of checks and balances was maybe more balanced, but still I just don't understand why for Americans this doesn't count, that the vote directly votes the president. I just don't see why, or I just don't understand why Americans put so much trust in the system, and why, or maybe there is already maybe a civil movement that maybe even wants to change the system.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, I got the question. It was a question about the popular vote, which were won, I mean, last time from Hillary Clinton with 3 million votes more than Donald Trump got, and the Electoral College who transfers these votes from the states to, something very different. And the question is, why are the people trust the system, and why doesn't the popular vote really count, and why is the Electoral College so influential?
John, you want to take it? I think
I'll take a stab at it.
In the first place.
What?
And maybe also why the Electoral College was created in the first place.
why is it?
And the follow-up question is why the Electoral College was Bild.
Well, it's in the Constitution.
In 5 minutes.
Yes. Mine will be very brief, and I'll defer to Mac too on this, and to Doug. It's in the Constitution, and it's not easy to change the Constitution. There have been several attempts to do that, and there are attempts continuing to do that. Of course, it cannot be done, or it will not be done prior to this election. There is a rather clever way around it, which is to do by interstate compact rather than constitutional amendment, and an agreement that states would select their electors based on the national popular vote if sufficient states join the interstate compact to do that. Right now, there has been an effort to do that, and it is about 4 or 5 states short, so it will not happen. But this is perhaps a little easier and more pragmatic way to get around the Electoral College to get to the popular vote.
But this means, just for the dumb German, now it's, if they're in Texas, 10 people go to the electoral, 10 people are the electoral college, 60% votes the Republican candidate, 40 the Democratic candidate. Now it's all the votes in the electoral college go to the Republican candidate. And if you change it, it would be that these 10% from the electoral college would vote 10 for the Republican, 4 for the Democrat. Would
6 and 4.
That's
6 for the Republican? Yes, sure. Texas.
I think the questioner, let me say a couple of things.
Yeah.
I believe that we should get rid of the Electoral College. It doesn't, in my opinion, do any good, and it certainly causes harm. And as you note, there have been 3 elections in the last 30 years where the person who received the majority of the votes did not become the president. And that strikes me as a bad result. The reason but as John said, it's very difficult. We can change it, but it's very difficult to change it because it's in the Constitution. And all 3 of those elections where the loser of the popular vote became the president, all 3 of those were a Republican becoming the president. So the Democrats generally would like to change that, and the Republicans generally would not. Why is that in the Constitution? The answer, as with many things in our country, goes back to slavery. When the Constitution was written back in the 1780s, the southern states wished to have more. The basic idea was that the Electoral College would distribute power to elect the president pursuant to the population of the various states. And the southern states said we should get credit for the slaves who live in these southern states because after all they're people, and so we should get credit for them as the apportionment of power in the election of the president is determined. However, the southern states continued, these people are slaves, and so we won't let them vote, but we should nonetheless get credit for them in this calculation. Anyway, a compromise was reached where for enslaved people in the American South in 1787, the southern states received 3/5 credit for enslaved people. So that had the effect of giving them a power in the Electoral College greater than would be commensurate with their number of voters, but lesser than would be commensurate with their number of total people, including enslaved people. Enslaved men, formerly enslaved men, were granted the right to vote after the Civil War in 1865. And of course, all women in our country were granted the right to vote in 1920, 100 years ago. And the system of the Electoral College is a vestige of that compromise about slavery over 200 years ago. there have been a number of efforts, as John said, to change it. None have been successful. In order to change the Constitution, there needs to be a vote in Congress, and then it needs to be adopted, I think, by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So it's a very, very high bar. And to get rid of the Electoral College would be to reduce the power of a high number of states. You know, Wyoming, Montana, states with low populations would have reduced power, and states with high populations, California, Texas, Florida, New York, would gain a power commensurate with their population. So in the absence of, I hope that we are not far from a place where Americans will say the Electoral College is way too complicated, and it may or may not have made sense in 1787, but it certainly doesn't make sense now. And it's an open door for mischief, for something wrong to happen. And so let's have a popular vote where every vote is equal. I hope we are approaching a time when a movement like that would happen, as it did in 1972 or 70 with moving the voting age from 21 down to 18, as it did in 1920 with expanding the right to vote to women. You know, our country is in a very slow march toward equality in voting, but we are not all the way there.
I saw that there are some questions in the chat.
Why does a former military lieutenant colonel think that if Hillary Clinton would be president, he would be hunted down like a dog?
Right.
Half of my answer is I don't know, but half of my answer is that he is a consumer of news in which the left generally is characterized as crazy and violent, and Hillary Clinton in particular was characterized as mean and vindictive, and he has not exercised his powers of thinking to say, actually, that probably wouldn't happen. And again, you note evidence, but his decision-making process does not seem always to be evidence-based. And it's what he hears, and it's who he talks to.
Let me address.
Because he stands also excellent film on every level. So, Max, that goes to you. Yes.
I just want to address one other thing that was in chat about the registry. And one other encouraging thing that's happening in the United States is that several states already have moved, well, let me back up. In the United States, registering to vote is an opt-in system. You have to do something to register to vote. Several states have moved to what's called automatic voter registration. Nowhere near a majority, but several have. And there is what's called AVR, automatic voter registration movement. And that would make it an opt-out system, not an opt-in system. And we would end up with a lot more registered voters. The Brennan Center, which is one of the links from the website, Rigged the Film website, is a wonderful place, and they have a lot of information on that movement, which is, I think, also encouraging because 25%, I believe, of eligible voters are not registered. So I'm not talking about registered who don't vote. I'm talking about people who are not even registered to vote. If we could keep that movement going, we would at least get a lot more people registered to vote. And that would become a moot point then, because as you can see in the film, just the registration itself has become this big issue, right? all the photo ID requirements and so forth. So that is, I think, an encouraging movement as well. And I'm hoping it also continues.
I'm sure all these things appear irrational to a German. Why?
Well, we did the Second World War.
How can it be that 25 or 30% of Americans don't even register to vote? Don't they feel a sense of civic duty in that? And of the 70% or 75% who register, why do only 70% of them actually vote and fewer in non-presidential years? I don't have a good answer for that. And the modern trend is more negative than positive, I'm afraid, on the numbers. I will add one other thing that as I listen to this with my best attempt at putting on a German sense of it, is that there is an effort in some places to make voter registration be a federal responsibility, and that has no chance of succeeding. The states, there is a very strong movement, very strong feeling in the United States that we need to maintain power in the state governments to balance the power of the federal government, and that keeping voting and all the things concerning voting centered in the states rather than centered in the federal government is one of the balances of our system. And that is a broadly held view, and I don't anticipate that one changing anytime soon. And it just strikes me that that would be seen as, what is the logical basis for that? If you lived in Germany, but that's a different thing about the United States, I would say.
As I said, we can't answer all the questions, and we can't discuss everything which is interesting about the film and the voter suppression. But I think you have now the chance for more or less one last sentence before I make the final words, because I also said that your film Rigged is also a call to action, but it's also questions: what can we do, or what should be done?
Well, I'll take a start at this, and John and Doug, you'll have your thoughts. For the American citizens eligible to vote, I would obviously suggest in the strongest terms that you make sure you're registered, and you make sure you're voting, and you make sure that everybody around you who's eligible to vote is doing the same, and that this year you do it early, because this will be a high turnout election, both in in-person voting and in vote by mail. And I would encourage that. In terms of changing these laws, that happens mostly at the states, and it starts with the election of state representatives. And so for people who believe that these laws are the wrong approach and wish them to be changed, I encourage you to get involved in state legislative races in your state, and that you make your voice be heard in those elections and in the time after those people are elected, and focus them on this. I also urge people to support organizations. The Brennan Center is an excellent place to start, as Doug said, but there are others, and we'd be happy to provide a list. I would urge people to support the vast array of organizations supporting the right to vote. In this period before the national election, that might be organizations registering voters, helping register voters. There's something called Reclaim Our Vote, which is helping purged voters regain their registration. There are all kinds of terrific organizations helping people protect the right to vote. And we'd be happy to circulate a list of that in the chat, or speak to people by email one by one with how they can help, either by giving money or by becoming active themselves.
And they are also listed on the homepage.
Yeah.
So I think, John, your final thoughts on the film.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Lichtblick as well, and to you, Alex, and to all who showed up for this. As far as remedies are concerned, Mac has just listed many of them. I think we need to be wary. We need to anticipate all kinds of problems in this particular election. Lastly, I'd say it's great to have input from a Berlin audience. There's a lot that we can learn from trying to answer your questions and learning from your observations. So thank you very much.
I would just echo what John just said. It was great to have a Berlin audience, and it was great to get questions from people who are scratching their heads about the American system. I can fully understand that. In fact, there are some Americans like us who are scratching our heads. But I wouldn't want to echo, I'll just be very specific. Right now, if you want to do something very, very specific, contact Florida politicians and tell them to stop impeding the right of ex-felons to vote. They've already got the money because of Bloomberg stepping up with the money. Now the Florida is trying to treat that like you're paying somebody off to vote. And this is quite specific. You write to Governor DeSantis, say this is ridiculous. The people of Florida, that was an initiative. The people of Florida gave these ex-felons the right to vote. And then roadblock after roadblock. So everybody can do something specific like that. Organizations to support are like Flippable. It's a great organization at the state and sub-state level. Emily's List also supports a lot of state and local groups. So if you're not in the United States, if you're an expat in Germany, you certainly can donate, and you can write, like I said, something specific like supporting the ex-felons. It's a Brennan Center has, I think it's the ACLU, where it's called Restore the Vote, which is like, I guess, Reclaim the Vote, but it's called Voter Restoration, also goes by that name. But right now, Florida is one of the key states for that issue. So, but there are lots of things that we can do. And once again, I think the website is a great starting point to connect you to a lot of these contacts. And thanks again. So that's all I'll say. Thanks.
My pleasure. And now, thanks, Meg, to you again for the film. And
thank you.
Tell it also to the director and the team now. And Meg, John, and Duke, for you for participating on this discussion and for your input. I mean, I would say I learned a lot, but I can say we learned a lot. They say yes. And I said in the beginning that we are doing this as a one world screening. Yeah, that was the thing. And our next screening is on Tuesday, October the 13th. And it's called, or it's a film, Meet the Donors, Does Money Talk? The director is Alexandra Pelosi. Some may know her mother, Nancy Pelosi. And she is talking to donors or big spenders from parties, mostly the Democratic Party, from obvious reasons, and also to some Republican donors, and why they are doing it, and what they hope from these donations. And on this discussion, as far as I know, Duke and John, you will join me also in 2 weeks. I think it was so. Yeah.
I'm planning on it, right.
So we can dive into some other issues, maybe with an expert to lobbying from Germany or the German perspective. So I think, thank you. And normally I would say drive home safely, but now it's...
Wir sind schon zu Hause.
I'm not.
Oh, no.
So
Okay.
stay healthy. Can everybody chant it? And a big applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye to America.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, Berlin. Thank you, Axel.
Thanks,
Yep.
Axel.